My name is Marlene. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent the last 16 years working in a law office making sure that what people say in a room matches what ends up on paper. I'm good at it. I catch the difference between what someone meant and what they actually signed. I catch it in contracts, in depositions, in the careful pauses people leave inside sentences when they're hoping you won't push. I did not catch it in Diane. I want to say that up front. I know what I do for a living. I know how people hide things. And for 3 years, I sat across from Diane Calloway at Sunday brunches and neighborhood association meetings and a weekend trip to Asheville where we stayed in the same hotel room and split a bottle of red wine between us while she told me about her ex-husband and his gambling problem and how she had finally gotten herself into a place of real financial stability. I believed every word. I helped her get there. That's the part that will take me the longest to explain. But to understand how we got to the Tuesday morning in February when I sat in my car in the parking lot of an Aldi and read a text message chain that contained my name 47 times in 6 days, to understand what it felt like to see what my best friend had done with my name while I was still calling her my best friend, I have to go back to the beginning. To the coffee meeting. To the spreadsheet she asked me to help her with. To the Sunday afternoon I chose to be useful instead of careful, and what that choice eventually cost me. Clover Falls, Ohio is the kind of town where your dentist knows your mother and your neighbor leaves corn on your porch in August with a note that just says corn. Population just under 40,000. One movie theater. A Panera that locals still call by the name of the diner it replaced. I moved there from Columbus 12 years ago after my divorce, looking for something slower, and I found it. The law firm where I work, Hatcher and Bloom, Estate and Family Law, sits on the main street between a florist and a bank, and most mornings I walk there from my house, past the same maple tree, past Mrs. Carlin walking her basset hound, past the coffee cart where a man named Pete has been making my order wrong for 6 years in exactly the same way, and I never correct him because by now it would feel like a change. I met Diane at a neighborhood association meeting about the speed bump proposal on Elm. She sat next to me, rolled her eyes when the third person in a row spoke for 6 minutes about drainage, and afterward said, "I was watching your face. You agree with me that this was a complete waste of an hour." She was right. We went for coffee. We agreed on other things. Within 6 months she was the person I called when something happened that I didn't know how to categorize. She was warm. She was funny in a dry, efficient way that I respected. She had opinions about things, restaurants, local politics, whether a particular contractor was honest, and her opinions were usually right. She had 2 kids, Bria and Theo, and she talked about them with a matter-of-factness that I liked, without performance or complaint. She ran a small bookkeeping business from her home office, 3 or 4 small clients, nothing major. She said she was building it slowly, carefully, the way she did everything. I should say here, I'm good at reading people. Or I was. Or I thought I was. What I was actually good at, I understand now, was reading people in professional contexts, when they were on the other side of a table, or where they were being observed. In that mode I'm nearly impossible to fool. Outside of it, among people I'd decided to trust, I had a habit that I hadn't yet identified as a habit. I stopped looking. I filed things away, small inconsistencies, odd pauses, things that didn't quite line up, and I told myself they were noise. Diane was the first time that habit had consequences I couldn't undo. It started with the spreadsheet. This was late spring of 2021, almost exactly 18 months into our friendship. Diane mentioned over coffee that she was trying to take on a new client, a small hardware store on the edge of town, family-owned, 2 generations in, but their records were a disaster and she wasn't sure how to approach rebuilding their accounts from partial documentation. "You deal with financial records all day," she said. "Could you just look at what they've given me and tell me if there's anything obvious I'm missing?" I said yes. Of course I said yes. I went to her house the following Saturday. We sat at her kitchen table with the hardware store's records, 3 years of inconsistent receipts, partial bank statements, tax documents that had clearly been prepared by whoever was cheapest rather than whoever was most careful. It took me about 4 hours to sketch out a workable framework for her, the sequence of steps that would let her reconstruct a usable picture from the fragments. We ordered pizza. She poured wine. She said, "I couldn't have done this without you. You know that, right?" "I know that now." What I didn't know at the time was that while I was helping Diane with that hardware store, I was also helping her understand what I didn't know. I was demonstrating, in a very practical way, the specific limits of my attention when I was in a helping mode. I focus on the problem in front of me, I solve it efficiently, I don't look behind me. Diane was a good observer. She filed that away. The next time was 2 months later. Her car registration. She needed to transfer a vehicle into her own name after a complicated situation with her ex, and the documentation was a tangle. I knew the process, made some calls, helped her understand what she actually needed versus what she'd been told she needed. A few hours. A favor for a friend. Then her youngest, Theo, had a situation at school, a mischaracterization in a disciplinary report that Diane felt was inaccurate. She asked me to look at the district's written policies and help her write a formal response. I did. I want to be precise here, none of these things were Diane asking me to do anything inappropriate. They were favors. Reasonable favors between friends. The pattern I didn't see until much later was that each one was also a lesson. I was teaching her, without knowing I was teaching her, exactly how I operated, methodical, thorough, trusting once trust was established, disinclined to look behind me at what I'd already closed. Looking back, that was the classroom. I just didn't know I was the one being studied. In the fall of that year, Diane mentioned that she was going through a cash flow problem. Her largest client, a dental practice she'd been bookkeeping for 2 years, had changed owners and the new owners wanted to bring in their own accounting firm. She lost the income overnight. She had reserves, she said, but they wouldn't cover everything. She was going to have to get creative. I didn't think much about the word creative. I had heard it used that way before, as a euphemism for tighten the belt, look for smaller clients, make do. I offered to help her find leads. I mentioned her to one of our firm's smaller administrative clients who I knew was looking for someone to organize their quarterly filing. I made an introduction. Diane followed up. She got the job. I was glad. It didn't occur to me to wonder whether I'd just become, without realizing it, a resource Diane was managing. Sometime that winter, I can't pin the exact date, but it was before Christmas, because the florist next to our office had the wreaths up, I started to notice something I couldn't name at the time. Diane was occasionally offline in a way she hadn't been before. Not unreachable, not dramatically absent, just slower to respond. She'd reschedule things at the last minute, citing busy periods, new clients, the kids' schedules. It was minor. I didn't track it consciously. What I did notice, and chose not to examine, was a change in how she talked about money. She'd had a period of obvious stress when she lost the dental client. Then that stress had visibly lifted, more quickly, I thought, than the timeline of the administrative referral I'd made would explain. She seemed comfortable again. She mentioned repainting her living room. She replaced her laptop. She took Bria and Theo to Florida over winter break. I thought, good. She'd figured something out. The bookkeeping business had found its footing. I was glad for her. I was choosing not to look, and I had dressed that choice up as generosity. The text messages I found in February were not mine. Let me be precise about this, because the precision matters. I didn't go through Diane's phone. I didn't snoop. What happened was considerably more mundane and, in retrospect, considerably more like the kind of thing that happens when someone is careless because they've started to feel safe. Diane had borrowed my tablet, we were at my kitchen table, working on an invitation list for a neighborhood association event we were co-organizing, and her phone battery had died. She used my tablet to text someone a quick reply. When she left, she forgot to log out of the app. I didn't notice for a few hours. When I went to check a recipe later that evening and picked up the tablet, I saw the open message window, and the name of the group thread it was part of. The name of the thread was Marlene Updates. I want to be very accurate about what I did in the next 30 seconds. I did not make a decision to read it. I did not weigh my options. I saw my name and my hands operated the screen before my brain had finished processing what I was looking at, and then I was reading. I read it twice through before I set the tablet face down on the counter and walked to the other side of the kitchen and stood there for a moment looking at the tile backsplash my ex-husband had installed 12 years ago because I'd asked him to. The thread had 6 participants, including Diane. 3 of them I recognized immediately: Gwen Marlett, who sat on the neighborhood association board with us; Paul Osher, who Diane had introduced to me 2 years earlier as a potential connection for a freelance project; and someone listed only as K that I couldn't immediately place. The remaining 2 were numbers without names. The thread ran back 11 days. I counted 47 uses of my name. The substance of it was this: Diane had told the people in that thread that I had offered to help her with a client's financial records, which was true, and that in the course of that help I had taken the records home without authorization and used information from them in a way that benefited a competing business. She had presented this as something she'd discovered recently. She had said she was deciding what to do about it. She had said she didn't want to believe it of me but that the evidence was clear. None of this had happened. I stood at the kitchen counter for another minute. Then I picked up the tablet, photographed each screen of the thread with my phone, logged Diane out of the app, and put the tablet back on the table exactly where it had been. I did not call her. I did not text her. I went back to my recipe. That night I didn't sleep much, but that wasn't the same thing as not thinking. I was thinking very precisely, in the way I think when something lands on my desk at the firm that requires careful attention, sequentially, without rushing to conclusions, following each thread to where it actually led. By morning I had a list. Not of what I was going to do, not yet, but of what I needed to understand first. There's a thing I've learned from 16 years of estate and family law: the story someone tells isn't usually the whole story. It's the story they need you to believe right now. The actual story lives in the documentation, in the timeline, in the things that were done rather than said. People lie with words constantly and automatically. They lie with documents only when they think no one is looking. I started looking. I called the hardware store, the family whose records I'd helped Diane reconstruct in the spring of 2021. I knew the owner's name from when Diane had mentioned it during our work session. Marcus Yelverton, 3rd generation, the store had been in the family since 1978. I called and asked if we could meet, said I was following up on some administrative work Diane Calloway had done for them. Marcus was puzzled. Diane had stopped working for them after about 4 months, he said. He'd thought it was mutual, a good parting. He'd been surprised, actually, because she'd said she was going to have to step back from smaller clients for a while. I asked when that was. He said around September of 2021. That was 3 months before I noticed Diane's financial stress had lifted. I asked one more question, carefully, framed as routine administrative confirmation: had there been any concerns about the handling of their financial records during her engagement? He paused. He said no concerns. But he added, almost as an afterthought, that one thing had struck him as odd. After Diane left, he'd reviewed some of her work and found that one of their supplier accounts had been reconfigured in a way he didn't understand. Small dollar transfers. Quarterly. Nothing that set off an alarm individually, but he hadn't been able to get a clear explanation from her when he'd called to ask, and eventually he'd just corrected it and moved on. I thanked him. I wrote down exactly what he'd said, in quotes. Then I pulled up the administrative client I'd referred Diane to, the small nonprofit, Clover Falls Community Arts, whose board treasurer I knew professionally. I called her. We'd spoken a few times. I framed my questions carefully: general follow-up, routine. She told me that Diane had been with them for about 8 months before they'd had to let her go. There had been a discrepancy they couldn't quite account for, not large, a few $100s, but concerning. They hadn't pursued it formally because the amounts were small and the documentation was incomplete. Diane had attributed it to a data entry issue during the transition. I asked when this was. Late winter of 2022. I wrote that down too. What I was holding now was not a complete picture. But it had the shape of one. I hadn't put it all together yet with the Diane I knew, the one who had sat across from me at 100 tables, who had texted me when her daughter got into the honors program, who had stood with me in the hallway at a fundraiser and made me laugh when I needed it. What I was doing with the information felt clinical, dissociated, like working a case that belonged to someone else. That was a choice too. I made it consciously. If I let myself feel it fully, I would not think clearly. I would call her, or confront her, or do something driven by the specific injury of discovering that someone I loved had been quietly, methodically using me as cover while she took small amounts from people who trusted her, and also, apparently, building a story about me that she could use if she ever needed to deflect attention. The message thread told me that. The thread was not just gossip. It was preemptive. Diane was establishing, to people in our shared social and professional circle, that I had mishandled confidential financial records. She was building a version of events in which, if her behavior with any of her clients ever came to light, there was a pre-existing narrative: Marlene did it. Or at least, Marlene was the kind of person who might do it. I understood then that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay. I had been choosing it with Diane for months, maybe longer, filing the small inconsistencies under noise, under coincidence, under the assumption that a friend is a friend, and what I was sensing couldn't be what I thought I was sensing. What I was sensing had been right. I just hadn't been ready to pay. I was ready now. Before I did anything actionable, I gave her a chance. I want to be honest about why, not because I thought it would change things, not because I still believed there was a version of this where I'd misread everything. I knew what the records showed and what the thread said. I gave her a chance because I have a specific weakness: I have never been able to act decisively against someone without first letting them speak. It is not a virtue. It is a compulsion I dress up as fairness. I called Diane and asked if she could come over. I said I'd found some discrepancies in the community arts paperwork from our event and wanted to review them with her. This was partly true. She came over on a Thursday evening. She brought a bottle of wine. I didn't open the wine. I told her what I'd found. Not all of it, not the message thread, not the clients, just the outline. I said I'd been doing some follow-up on a few things and I had some questions about her work with a couple of clients we'd both been connected to. I watched her face. She went still first. A very precise stillness, the kind I've seen in depositions when someone is computing rather than reacting. Then she shifted into warmth. She said I'd misunderstood. She said the situation with the community arts account was a data error, she'd documented it all. She said Marcus Yelverton's supplier issue was a pre-existing problem she'd actually fixed for him, and she could show me the documentation if I wanted. I said I'd like to see it. She said she didn't have it with her but she'd send it over. I said that would be fine. Then I asked her one direct question: why was there a group message thread called Marlene Updates that contained 47 references to my name and a claim that I had improperly handled confidential client records? The stillness came back. Longer this time. She said, "You went through my phone." I said, "You left yourself logged into my tablet." She said the thread was a misunderstanding. She said she'd been trying to manage a complicated situation with a mutual connection who had raised questions about some paperwork, and she'd been explaining context. She said she would never actually say anything that damaged me. She said I was the most important person in her life, outside her kids. I watched her say all of it. I watched her face do what it always did: warm, reasonable, concerned, slightly hurt. I had seen that face for 3 years and I had always believed it. I believed exactly none of it now. I told her I needed a few days to think. She nodded. She picked up the wine she'd brought and left with it. I sat for a long time in the quiet after she left, and I understood something about myself that I had been too comfortable to see before. I had spent 3 years being useful to Diane, and I had confused being useful with being valued. They are not the same thing. One is a service. The other is a relationship. I had been providing the first while believing I was inside the second. She left without looking back from my front porch. I watched through the window, and I didn't feel what I'd expected to feel, not grief, not anger, not even that particular loneliness that follows the loss of someone who'd been close. I felt something quieter and more final. I had stopped hoping she would make me wrong. I started deciding what came next. I'm a paralegal. I know how to build a file. Over the next 3 weeks, I assembled one. I did not discuss it with Diane. I did not mention it to anyone in our shared social circle. I went to work each morning and I did my job, and I came home, and in the evenings I worked methodically through what I'd gathered, the notes from my conversations with Marcus Yelverton and the community arts treasurer, the screenshots of the message thread, the timeline I'd reconstructed from memory cross-referenced against texts and emails I still had on my phone. I am careful about records. I always have been. Every time Diane had asked me to help with something, the hardware store spreadsheet, the car registration, the school disciplinary response, I had sent her a follow-up message afterward summarizing what I'd done and any documents I'd handled, partly out of professional habit and partly because I had learned, in 16 years of family and estate law, that memory is unreliable and documentation is not. Those messages established, with timestamps, exactly what I had and had not accessed. I compiled it all into a clear, chronological document. 31 pages. Organized the way I would organize a client file: facts, evidence, timeline, correspondence. I called the attorney I work for, David Hatcher, and told him I had a personal matter I needed to discuss with him as a client, not an employee. He understood immediately what that meant. We met on a Saturday morning at the office. I handed him the file. He read it while I sat across from him and watched him read. Twice he paused and looked up at me over his glasses. Once he said, "This is good documentation." It wasn't a compliment, exactly. It was an acknowledgement. He made some calls. Not many. We were both aware of the actual dollar amounts, which were individually small, but the pattern they formed was significant. The community arts organization had a board. One of its members was a personal friend of David's. A quiet conversation was had. Diane was asked to produce her documentation. She produced some of it. What she produced didn't account for the discrepancy cleanly, and under further questioning, the explanation changed twice. The organization quietly engaged a different bookkeeper. The matter was referred to their insurance company, who made a determination. No criminal charges were filed. The amounts, in isolation, didn't reach the threshold that would have made prosecution practical, and the board preferred resolution to publicity. But a formal complaint was lodged with the state's bookkeeping licensure board, which opened an inquiry. I also sent a factual, documented letter to each of the 6 people in the Marlene updates thread. I did not editorialize. I did not call Diane names. I stated what I knew, with documentation attached, and I noted that a number of things represented in the thread about my professional conduct were factually incorrect and would be treated as defamatory if repeated. The letter from our firm's letterhead made that point clearly without requiring elaboration. 3 people responded. 2 apologized. 1, Paul Osher, called and talked for 20 minutes in a state of visible distress about how he'd never believed it anyway and he hoped I understood. I told him I understood, thanked him for calling, and ended the conversation. Gwen Marlett, who sat on the association board with me, sent a handwritten note. I kept it. Not for sentiment, for the record. The night after I sent the letters, I made myself dinner. Real dinner, not the distracted kind: roasted chicken, a salad, a glass of wine I chose myself. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet and I thought about the fact that for 3 years I had sat at this table with Diane talking about everything and nothing, and I had felt, during those years, genuinely known. I had been known, in a way. Just not in the way I thought. She had known exactly what I was useful for and exactly what I would overlook if I was trusted. I ate my dinner slowly. Outside it was getting dark. The maple tree on the street caught the last light, I stayed at the table until there wasn't any light left, and then I washed the dishes, and I slept without any trouble at all. The inquiry from the licensure board took 5 months. During that time, Diane called me twice and sent 4 texts. I did not respond to any of them. The calls and texts were not apologetic. They were the kind of messages that are designed to look apologetic but function as information gathering. She was trying to understand how far things had gone. I noted the dates and saved them all. In late July, Diane's license was formally suspended for 18 months pending the outcome of a more comprehensive audit of her client records that the board had opened. She lost 2 remaining clients as a result. The third, a small insurance broker on the south side of town, left shortly after. I know this because people talk in Clover Falls. I didn't ask for updates. They arrived on their own, through the same channels by which everything in a town of 40,000 arrives, through Pete at the coffee cart saying he'd heard something, through the florist asking carefully how I was doing, through a neighbor mentioning something in passing. I also know, because Marcus Yelverton told me when I ran into him at the hardware store 6 months later, that the supplier account Diane had reconfigured had been quietly siphoning a small percentage of his vendor payments into an account he didn't recognize for 14 months. The total wasn't large, under $4,000 across the whole period, but it was systematic. 100 here, 150 there, always under the threshold that would trigger an automatic review flag. She had taught herself that, I thought, standing in Marcus's store with a box of 16-penny nails in my hand. She had taught herself by watching how I work, by learning where I stopped looking. I had been an instrument of her education. Marcus asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I said yes. We did, the following Tuesday. He told me about his grandfather, who had opened the store in 1978 with $40 in inventory and a borrowed truck. I liked him. I still do. Paul Osher called again in August. He wanted to tell me that Diane had approached him to ask for a character reference, in relation to the licensure proceedings. He wanted me to know, he said, in case I felt I needed to respond to it. He said he had declined. I thanked him and told him I didn't need him to do anything further. He said, I should have asked more questions. I said, yes. Not unkindly. Just yes. There's a version of this where I hold that against him, against all of them, the 6 people in the thread who had let their names sit next to mine in a conversation built on a fabrication. I understand the version. I even think it's fair. But I've worked in family law long enough to know what I know about people and loyalty. Most people, when given an easy story that doesn't require them to work hard or take sides, will take the easy story. Diane was charming and warm and credible in exactly the way that makes an easy story available. I didn't hold it against them with any heat. Gwen remains on the neighborhood association board. I see her at the monthly meetings. She is careful with me now, precise in her consideration, in a way that costs her something. I think it should. In September, I got a voicemail. Diane's voice. She sounded tired, genuinely tired, not performed. She said she knew I wasn't going to pick up. She said she needed to tell me something, and she needed to say it to something that would record it even if I never heard it. She said she had a contractor she needed, a specific piece of paperwork for her house refinancing, something she'd discovered she needed a professional to notarize and witness, something that for complicated reasons she couldn't take to a standard notary because of the ongoing proceedings, and a technicality that I would understand if she explained it. She was asking me for help. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. Not because I needed to hear it again, I understood what she was saying the first time, but because I was making sure I heard it correctly. She had built a thread designed to protect herself at my expense, had deployed my name as a buffer between herself and accountability, had called me the most important person in her life and then left with her wine bottle when I asked her a direct question. And now she needed a favor that only someone with my specific professional skill set could provide. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. Then I called her back. She answered on the second ring, with a kind of held breath quality, the quality of someone who has been waiting and is trying not to show it. I said, I got your message. She said, I know this is a lot to ask. I said, yes. It is. And then I said, I'm going to give you the name of a notary service that can handle this remotely, regardless of pending proceedings. I'll text it to you in the next 10 minutes. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, that's all? I said, that's all, Diane. I found the information. I sent it. I put the phone down and went to water my plants, which I had been neglecting for about a week, and I stood in my kitchen with the watering can in my hand and I thought about all the ways I could have handled that phone call. The ways that would have felt more like justice. The ways that would have let me say what I wanted to say. The ways that would have given her, finally, the version of me that was angry. I thought about all of them and I chose none of them, and I don't think that was weakness. I think I had already done what needed to be done, carefully, through the right process, with documentation. The voicemail was just an echo. I didn't owe it a response that cost me anything. I gave her what I would give anyone who called my office with a basic question. No more. A closed door only has power over you while you're still standing on the other side of it, working up the feeling you'll need to finally knock. The day I stopped drafting the speech I was going to give Diane, stopped rehearsing what I'd say when she finally acknowledged what she'd done, was the day I got my own life fully back. She didn't acknowledge it. She asked me for a notary referral instead. I gave her one. And then I was done. What I have now, the same house, the same maple tree, the same Pete at the coffee cart making the wrong order with such consistency that I've come to think of it as his signature. The neighborhood association, minus Diane, which has managed to keep functioning, though we now have 40-minute debates about the speed bump instead of 20-minute ones, which tells you something about what her organizational skills were actually worth. Marcus Yelverton's hardware store, where I am now a regular, and where his daughter, home from college, working the register on weekends, remembers my name and has my account in the system. My work is the same. My office at Hatcher and Bloom faces the alley and gets good light in the mornings. I document everything, as I always have. I help people understand what they actually signed and what it actually means. I am, professionally, useful to people on the worst days of their lives, and I am good at that, and I find it satisfying in a way that has not changed. What changed is smaller and harder to name. I am less generous with the benefit of the doubt, not toward strangers, not toward new clients, but toward the specific category of people who have earned a degree of trust and then begin, in small ways, to trade on it. I notice those small ways now. I do not file them under noise. I look behind me. I kept the voicemail. It's in the same folder on my phone as the screenshots of the message thread, everything sorted by date, everything labeled. I don't look at it. I keep it for the same reason I keep everything, because what is recorded is what is real, and what is real is what you have when everything else is taken away. The last Sunday in October, I made brunch for myself and sat at the kitchen table where Diane and I had sat hundreds of times, and I ate it slowly, and I watched the maple tree out the window change colors in a way that happens every year with a kind of urgency, as if it's surprised by its own transformation, and I thought, I am not surprised by mine. Diane was not a predator in the way that word implies, cold, deliberate, detached from the damage she caused. She was, I think, something more ordinary and therefore more instructive, a person who had discovered that charm is a form of leverage, and that leveraging it doesn't feel like theft while you're doing it. It feels like resourcefulness. It feels like making the most of what you have. What she had, centrally, was me, my professional knowledge, my network, my credibility, and my specific flaw, which she had identified and named internally long before I identified it in myself. I fixed things instead of naming them. I stayed patient long past the point where patience was wisdom. She didn't manufacture those tendencies in me. She simply noticed them, assessed their utility, and made them part of a system that worked in her favor for several years. The preemptive smear campaign, the message thread, the 47 uses of my name, is the part that deserves the most precise examination, because it's the part that reveals the most about what she was actually afraid of. She wasn't afraid of me confronting her. She was afraid of being caught by someone else and having no story ready. The thread was insurance. It was the same methodical, quiet preparation she brought to everything else. She built it the same way she'd reconfigured Marcus Yelverton's supplier accounts, gradually, in small amounts, below the threshold where anyone would trigger an alarm. What she miscalculated was that I document everything. Always have. Not because I expected betrayal, but because my profession trained me to treat documentation as protection against the unforeseeable, against the client who changes their story, against the paperwork that gets lost, against the version of events that shifts between Tuesday and Thursday. My habit protected me precisely because she had learned my habits and assumed she knew them completely. She had watched me closely enough to know what I tracked. She hadn't understood that what I track, I keep. There's something in this about the specific danger of being known by someone who is paying the wrong kind of attention. She watched me for 3 years. She understood my routines, my blind spots, my professional language. She used all of it. The intimacy of a friendship, turned fully instrumental, is its own category of violation, different from stranger fraud, different from institutional theft, because the access was granted voluntarily, in trust, and the betrayal therefore carries the full weight of what trust means when it's misplaced. The 3 people who called or wrote to apologize after receiving my letter were not bad people. They were people who had been given a credible story by someone they had no reason to distrust, in a social context where questioning someone's account of a friend carries its own social cost. That's how reputation works as a weapon. You use the texture of normal social behavior, the group thread, the confiding tone, the "I'm not sure what to do about this" framing, and you move through it without triggering the skepticism that a more obvious attack would provoke. Diane was good at this. She had practiced. What I came away with is not a lesson about distrust. Distrust is not the takeaway, because distrust indiscriminately applied costs you everything that a friendship like the one I thought I had with Diane could have genuinely been. The takeaway is more specific. Attention is not the same as looking. I was paying attention to Diane constantly, her moods, her situations, her needs. I was looking at almost nothing. Looking requires a willingness to see something you'd rather not see, and I had quietly exempted Diane from that kind of examination because I had decided she was already known. She wasn't. She was performing being known. Those are not the same. If any part of this story lands for you, it's probably because you recognize that space, the space between someone familiar and someone known. You've been in it. Maybe you're in it now. The question worth sitting with isn't how you missed the signs. Signs are always clear in retrospect, and retroactive clarity is the least useful form. The question is whether you're looking now, at the person you've already decided to trust completely, with the particular kind of attention that trust is supposed to make unnecessary. That's the harder practice. That's the one worth keeping.